when they go to make a sincere act of tawbah, what they do is they reorient themselves and they refocus themselves on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they turn away from everything that they were engaged in beforehand. Right? So this is the idea of at-tawbah, right? And this is the month of Rajab in which the Prophet ﷺ used to often make dua and say, Allahumma barik lana fi Rajab wa Sha'ban wa ballighna Ramadan. And so as we enter into this month, we know we enter into a season of Ramadan, right? A preparation for Ramadan that is connected. That's why the Prophet ﷺ would gather them in his dua, right? And so as we prepare for Ramadan, what is the best way that we can prepare for Ramadan? Fast, so you can get used to it. That's a good answer. Okay, what else? Yes, sir. Read Quran. Great answer. Another one. Make dua. Great answers. All of these are great answers, but what is something that's a little bit more essential? Ahsant. To leave behind any kind of sin that you are engaged in before you enter into the month of Ramadan, which is called what? Tawbah. Ahsant. Right? So that is the idea, right? The idea is that a person the first thing that a person must do is they must clear any harm, any toxic waste, right? Okay, let's say we're going to plant a garden. Right? You and I decide we're going to plant a garden. What's the first thing that we're going to do? If there's a bunch of toxic waste in the garden, are we going to be able to grow anything? No, of course not, right? The first thing that we have to do is remove the things that are harmful to the plants that we are planning to plant, right? So once we have removed those harms and we have cleared the soil, then the next step is to do what? Ahsant, plant the seeds. So the next step is to do what you boys were saying, right? You begin to fast more, you begin to read more Quran, you begin to make more dua. These are all seeds that one is planting, habits that one is creating for the month of Ramadan, so that when the month actually hits, it's not the first time that they're picking up the Quran. When the month actually hits, it's not the first time that a person is fasting. When the month actually hits, it is not the first time that a person is raising their hands in dua, right? So then what do they do in the month of Sha'ban, right? If I planted seeds and I just leave the seeds like that, will they grow? No. What do I have to do? You have to water the seeds, right? So how does a person water the seeds that they are planting? They must do more work in the month of Sha'ban as it leads up to Ramadan, and they pick up momentum. What happens if, for instance, I'm trying to run through that door, right? You lock me in here, and I'm trying to run through that door. Okay, if I'm 2 feet away from the door, and then I go like this, is that going to be the same as if I came all the way to the back of the room and then sprinted right at the door and hit it with my shoulder? No, it's not going to be the same. Why? Because the first time I didn't have momentum, but when I had momentum, I burst through any obstacle in front of me, right? And so that's the idea, is that we gain momentum going into the month of Ramadan, and we're able to break down any obstacle that stands between us as we try to come closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? Everybody wants to ask the question when Ramadan is actually here. How can I get more out of Ramadan? Why do I find it difficult to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Ramadan? Why is it that I'm dealing with all of these different wasawis even though the shayateen are locked up? The answer to that question began 2 months before Ramadan. Why is it that you're still having bad thoughts in the month of Ramadan? Because you never did the work to lay the ground before you planted the seeds. Why is it that you're having trouble performing acts of worship? Because you did not prepare by getting yourself used to performing acts of worship before Ramadan, right? This is why people do not have a good Ramadan when they struggle with their month, right? So what's the first thing? The first thing is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He's brought you all here. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He brings people into places of good, one of the things that He does, subhanahu, is that He will cast a urge into the hearts of the believers to come closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the ulama, when they talk about this, they call it the ba'ith, right? That a person will be, for instance, their entire life, like a person may go their entire life. And never once do they reflect to themselves, I want to come closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Never once do they think to themselves, I want to change my life around. Right? This is a person who their entire life they never experienced what the ulama call the ba'ith. Versus, alhamdulillah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He brought all of you guys here, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is casting into your guys' hearts a renewed intention to take advantage of your lives and to take advantage of the upcoming month of Ramadan. So this ba'ith, what does a person do with it now? Right? Now that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has encouraged you all to be better, encouraged you all to do more, encouraged all of us to try to be better Muslims, what is the first thing that we must do? It's a question. Okay, evaluate. That's good. That's a really good answer. What else? Shukr, ahsant. And shakartum la'azidannakum. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, and if you thank me, I will increase you, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has called you. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has said, my beloved servant, I want you to come closer to me. This is something that requires shukr from all of us. What then? Who can tell me? Dua, that's good. Quran, that's great. We're talking about more essential than just Quran and dua. You guys have given those answers too many times. Yes, sir. Okay, pushing back your sins. All right. No, not so. Not so. What? When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala calls you, is it enough to simply leave it on hakada, let it ring? What must a person do then? They must answer the call that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made. They must respond to the call that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made. And they must respond to the energy that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has placed within their hearts. Right? It is not enough that a person continue to gain motivation throughout their life. Every single day they come into the masjid, they pray Isha, they feel better, they make an intention to be better, and then they go home and they do nothing about it. This will never cause change in the person's life. What must they do? They must respond to the call of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and take a practical step towards changing their lives, right? And this is the nature of responding to this call from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is that the more that one responds, the louder that call will get. And the louder that voice will get. However, the inverse is also true. If a person, every time they have a waswasa from the shaitan, they respond to that waswasa, what's going to happen? The waswasa is going to get louder. The waswasa is going to get louder. It's going to push them back, right? The waswasa is going to get louder. What happens every single time somebody's nafs wants something, they respond. What's going to happen? More sins. Why? Because the nafs is going to get stronger and louder, right? And so this is a principle that whenever somebody is experiencing these kinds of inclinations, whether they be to good or whether they be to bad, the ones that they respond to are going to become the ones that are louder and louder. A person may think to themselves, why is it that the month of Ramadan has come along and all of the shayateen are locked up, and yet I'm still having all of these different thoughts and I'm having all of these different inclinations to do all of these bad things, right? Why is that? That's because a person has responded to their ego to the point where they have caused their ego to become so strong that it orders them and commands them to do things that they do not want to do, right? And so a person has to be careful about this, right? A person has to be careful about this because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will lock up the shayateen, but He won't lock up the ego. He won't lock up the ego. And so a person has to be careful, right? Tayyib. Now, how does a person make tawbah? Right? Now that a person has the sincere intention in their heart, what does a person do? They ask for forgiveness. Okay, that's great. What else? Ahsant. They regret their actions. Okay, that's the first step. What do they do after they regret their actions? How do they repent? That's the question. By praying, okay. Reading Quran. Why you guys, all your answers reading Quran and fasting and stuff? What's that? Huh? Istighfar. Okay, great. Yeah, they ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for forgiveness. But what must they do for their istighfar to be accepted?
not sincerity.
Sincerity, ahsant, okay.
They need to make commitments not to go back.
Ahsant. They make a commitment not to go back, right? Okay, so here are the 4 steps. There's 4 steps, tamam? If everybody leaves here tonight and they've memorized these 4 steps, khalas, okay, I can go home happy that I did my job, tamam? The first step is that a person sincerely regret having performed the sin. Tamam? Tayyib, I was doing a thing that I shouldn't have done, okay? And now I sincerely regret it. What do I do next? The next step is that they leave the sin immediately. Not, okay, I regret it and I feel bad about it, but I'm just going to keep on doing it and inshallah Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will inspire me to make tawbah tomorrow. No, because you might not get tomorrow, habibi. You might not, who told you you're going to live till tomorrow? So a person leaves the sin immediately, right? The third step is that they make the intention to never, ever, ever, ever go back to that sin as long as they live. Now, notice here, I said he makes an intention, right? I didn't say that he leaves the sin forever and ever and ever and ever and ever. He might go back to that sin the next day. Literally, he might wake up the next morning and do the same sin. But what? When he made the tawbah, he was sincerely intending that he would never return to it. Not, okay, I'm making tawbah, I leave the sin, but I might go back to it. It's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to make mistakes. But the idea is that a person makes sincere intention that they will not make that mistake. That's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is looking for. And when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sees that somebody is sincere in this, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give them tawfiq. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us all tawfiq in that, right? That when we make that sincere intention that we not return to any sin that we've engaged in, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the tawfiq not to do so, right? Not to return to it. So then the fourth sin, or the fourth step, is if it involves the right of anybody else. And somebody was robbing people on the street, taking all of their money. Okay? Is it enough for him to simply stop robbing people and say, Ya Allah, I'm sorry, I regret it? No. What does he have to do? I said, return the rights of the people that he took. Right? So all of that money that he took from everybody, he has to return it now. It's not enough for him to say, Allah, I make tawbah. No, you have something that doesn't belong to you. It must go back to the person it belongs to. Right? Similarly, somebody spoke about somebody else. They did riba of a person, right? They have violated the honor of that person and they must seek either their forgiveness for that or they, khalas, they must, if they don't receive the forgiveness of that person, then they must ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to please them on their behalf on Yawm al-Qiyamah. Right? They must make a lot of dua for that person. And that's why riba, the hadith that talk about riba are so severe. Because it is so hard to make tawbah from riba. It's so difficult to make tawbah from riba. Imagine you were talking about me all night last night. Now you have to come and tell me, Muhammad, afwan, we were talking about you all night last night and we said all these mean things. Please forgive me. It's extremely difficult to do. There's a few people, mashallah, Allah gives them tawfiq, they still do it. But it's extremely difficult to do. And that's why there's such severe warnings against doing riba, because it's so hard to come back from. And so a person must keep in mind that if they have violated the rights of anybody else, they must return those rights. And if they're unable to, they must ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on their behalf that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless them and give them on Yawm al-Qiyamah that which they will cause them to forgive them, right? So this is how a person makes tawbah. And then we'll close with this, right? What does a person make sin from? Or what does a person make tawbah from? There's 3 types of sins, okay? There's 3 categories. The first is a sin that a person commits between themselves and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Tamam? He looked at something he wasn't supposed to look at. Tayyib. He ate something he wasn't supposed to eat. Right? This is not a sin where he violated somebody else's right, but he violated the rights of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he violated the limits of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What is the way that a person makes tawbah from this? A person simply makes tawbah between themselves and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They follow the first 3 steps and they make a sincere intention not to return to it ever again. Khalas. That's the end of that. Now the second category is non-performance, meaning a person did not perform an obligation. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said you must pray 5 times a day. The person doesn't pray 5 times a day. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says you must fast Ramadan. The person didn't fast Ramadan. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says you must give zakat. The person didn't give zakat. Tayyib, what does this person have to do now? Is it enough for them to simply say, Ya Allah, I'm sorry? No, the person has to make up that which they missed. Right? It is obligatory upon a person who misses a prayer that they make that prayer up. It is obligatory upon a person who misses their zakat that they make that zakat up. It is obligatory upon a person that misses a fast that they make that fast up, especially if it was missed without excuse. Is that clear? And so this is the way that a person makes that tawbah, right? And then the third is if they took the right of another, right? If they took the right of another, then what we just spoke about, right? What we just spoke about, that a person, that they tried their best to appease the person that they took the right of, right? And then if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala opens it up for them and their hearts open and soften to that person, then all the better. But if not, then they ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to please them on Yawm al-Qiyamah on their behalf, right? And then ultimately, and we'll close with this point, is that a person should always maintain a state of brokenheartedness with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Like, this is Allah. He knows everything about you and He's given you everything. Right? A person should never come to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala beating their chest and saying, Ya Allah, I did this for you and I did that for you. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that blessed you to be able to do it in the first place. Were it not for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's tawfiq, you wouldn't have done any of it. Right? It was a gift from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to you that you were ever able to do it in the first place. Right? Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam, it's narrated that Sayyidina Musa had a conversation with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala where he asked him about this. He said, Ya Allah, how do I thank you when my thanking you requires thanks? Does anybody understand the question? Ya Allah, how do I thank you when my thanking of you requires that I be thankful? Like, I need to be thankful for the fact that I was able to thank you in the first place. So how do I thank you? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala responds to Sayyidina Musa. He says, Ya Musa, your recognition of this, your understanding of this is thanks enough. And so a person must remain, they must have what is called shuhud al-minnah. They must always witness Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's bounty upon them. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's favor upon them, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave them the tawfiq to come to a halaqa, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave them the tawfiq to pray in jama'ah, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to give them the tawfiq inshallah to wake up and pray fajr on time. All of these different things, they're gifts from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that require our thanks. And so we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He give all of us to have a blessed end of Rajab and a blessed Sha'ban, and to allow us all to reach Ramadan bi khairin wa lutfin wa afiyah, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us all tawfiq to take the most out of Ramadan, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us all tawfiq to make a sincere tawbah to Him subhanahu wa ta'ala. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam, walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.